Thank you all so much for coming out today on Super Bowl Sunday, apparently, which we didn't realize when we scheduled this, but we really appreciate you guys picking Salt Marshes over Super Bowl this evening. So today we're doing an evening of salt marsh research and work that the Conservation Foundation is doing. And so you're going to hear from a couple of speakers that have worked or are currently working with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation in our coastal ecology program. I'm going to kick things off by giving a bit of a background to what our coastal ecology program is, some of the research work that the foundation does, and then why we're really interested in salt marshes and why we have these research programs happening. So I'm Dr. Jen Karberg. I'm the Director of Research and Partnerships with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and my email is up here on the screen if you feel like getting in touch with me. I guess it's kind of over in the right corner over there. So this is the mission of the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. I'm sure a lot of you know who we are, but we are a nonprofit land trust solely here on Nantucket, owning over 9,000 acres of land, both inland and coastal shoreland, and we're going to talk a lot about the coastal areas today. We conserve Nantucket's rare and significant natural resources. We engage in really impactful, important ecological research that we then use to inform our restoration and help other people with their restoration and management of properties. We also really like to share the work that we're doing in ways that is with the wider community and also in an educational way, and provide ways for people to interact on our properties. At the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, we have an ecological research, stewardship, and restoration department. And this makes us really unique for land trusts. Not a lot of land trusts have their own research department in-house. And we have currently 4 different ecological programs or focuses of research. And we have year-round ecologists that work in each of those programs, as well as field assistants, technicians, and graduate students that come help us do work within these different areas. I'm sure many of you have maybe been on one of our bat walks with the Wildlife Ecology Program, or have gone on a walk with Kelly and our native plant gardens, or somewhere out on one of our properties to learn about plants in the botany program. Our Restoration Ecology Program focuses on restoration work. One of our biggest projects right now is the Windswept Bog Restoration Project. And then tonight we're focusing on our Wetland and Coastal Ecology Program, and you're going to learn about a lot of the research there. The picture that's up here is of our oyster reef restoration project out in Pulpus Harbor. So we're talking about salt marshes today. This is a map of Nantucket, and all of the pink are the salt marshes. We have approximately 1,600 acres of salt marsh on the island, and the Conservation Foundation owns approximately 1,200 of those acres. So it's a really important natural ecological system for us to focus on in our Wetland and Coastal Ecology Program. And I'll talk about why you should care about salt marshes in a minute. Salt marshes are all concentrated, as you can see, within our harbors. There need to be in areas behind barrier beaches or slightly protected from very intense constant wave action. So that's why you see them around Nantucket Harbor. Pulpus Harbor has a very large concentration of salt marshes, and out in Nantucket Harbor. And the bottom note here that we're going to talk about as I move through this, they're not usually naturally erosional. They're very, very stable habitats. And when we start to talk about coastal resilience and sea level rise and storms, that's something important to remember and why we really care about the health of our salt marshes. So this is it's a side diagram of a salt marsh. And I like this because everything that happens in the salt marsh is driven by elevation. Very, very small changes in elevation change the amount of water that's coming in on a tide cycle twice a day. Every single day, salt water is moving in and out of salt marshes. They're very heavily impacted by the water that's around them. Water's pretty stressful for plants and things that are growing within salt marshes. So having that water in a salt marsh, but also coming in and out and changing that height and where that water is going twice a day, every day, creates a really unique ecosystem. There are different things that live at different elevational levels within the salt marsh. The lines that you see here really have to do with, what is a normal low tide? So that's down here in our mudflat areas. That's where our crabs are. That's where our fish are. We have our normal high tide area, and that is our low marsh, and where an area that gets underwater, definitely underwater, twice a day, every single day. And you have very specific things that grow there because it's such a harsh condition. Very specific plants, but then lots of animals and shellfish and other things are using that area. Then you have where your spring high tide is, so places that only get underwater once or twice a month, but the soil's usually pretty wet. So that's a difference to have it flooded only once or twice a month. And then you get into your upland areas behind that that currently never get flooded. I say currently because we'll talk about sea level rise in just a second. So why should you care about salt marshes besides that they're the coolest ecosystem that exists? There's a couple reasons. One is what's in them, what uses them. Approximately 80% of all commercially and recreationally important species in the Atlantic depend on salt marshes for some portion of their life cycle. Whether they're going in to feed, whether they're used as nurseries, overwintering grounds, almost everything. If you take a fishing rod out, if you take a boat out and go scalloping, if you're going out and using something within our waters, it depends on having a salt marsh in place. So Massachusetts and Nantucket, those species are up here on the screen, but our scallops, our clams, bluefish, striped bass, crabs, any of those things depend on having salt marshes around. We also care about them for ways that they improve our water quality and ways that they improve the ecology of the areas around them. They're extremely important nutrient sinks. They act as a buffer between the harbor and the uplands, so fertilizer that's going on uplands and washing off ends up getting absorbed and utilized within the salt marsh itself, whether it's in the vegetation or in the soils as well. The soils store a lot of carbon as well as can hold on to a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. So they reduce those nutrient flows into the harbor, which is extremely important for the fisheries in our harbor. That helps improve water quality and then decrease the risk of algal blooms. So ecologically, salt marshes are extremely important habitat. Why else do we care about them? They're also extremely resilient, and I'll read these out because I realize if you guys are behind the podium, you can't see the bottom part of the screen over here. They're extremely resilient. They're naturally resilient habitats. They don't erode away. If you think of our other coastline habitats like dunes, coastal dune areas, their resilience is in that they change shape and move as you get storms and wave and wind moving over them. They're designed to move and shift. Salt marshes hold their ground. They're very steady, very strong. And big, broad expanses of salt marsh can actually take the force of storms and waves that are moving in and slow them down. They can decrease wave height, by over 50% as a large storm is coming in and hitting it. They can fill with water for a day or two, and then it can flood out, and the vegetation, the soils will still be there and still come back and be there the next day. So they don't get destroyed by being put under coastal storms, which is really important for resiliency. So this phrase down here says, as community, and this is a headline from a news article in 2017, as communities rebuild after hurricanes, studies show that wetlands can significantly reduce property damage. Having salt marshes in front of your upland areas reduces the impact that intense storms can have in an area. This one, coastal wetlands prevented approximately $625 million worth of property damage during Hurricane Sandy, which is something that we kind of have in recent memory here. It didn't impact Nantucket as well, but we know what it did in the Long Island and Sound area, and places that had intact salt marshes in front of them didn't suffer as much damage. This picture here is, actually, does anyone know where this is? I see a few nods. There's not usually this much water in it, Tobias.
I think this is right. This is like the inside corner of Pulpus.
Ooh, good idea. It's not. Anybody else? This is Folger's Marsh. So it's standing on Pulpus Road, looking out into Folger's Marsh at a very high tide storm. And you can see a little bit of salt marsh on the edge there. You can see a little bit of it out. There's actually storms where you can't see any of that salt marsh grass. But this marsh can have this much water on it For even up to 5 days, with the wind of a storm and a high tide holding that water in, and essentially what would drown any other habitat, this salt marsh will bounce right back from it. It'll drain out, and then it'll take that water again the next time it comes in, and it'll stay in place. So they create amazing barriers and buffers to increase resiliency on our shoreline. This is a diagram of living shorelines are essentially the idea that you can protect your shoreline through a natural solution, something that comes and is based on nature, is more resilient than building a hard wall, which might hold the water out for a while, but will eventually cause more damage than it solves. In this yellow box are all of the things that salt marshes do and do well as a living shoreline. They're able to naturally trap sediments that are moving in and rise in elevation, which as sea level rise comes up and up, elevation is more and more important. They improve water quality, habitat for fisheries, all these things that I was mentioning about salt marshes. Salt marshes and oyster reefs as well can be natural barriers to waves and the force of storms that are coming in. And living shorelines are always more resilient against storms than bulkheads. So this is another reason that we care about our salt marshes besides the ecological value. So today the research that you're going to hear about really is kind of focusing in on how we're going to manage the changes that are happening with climate change and sea level rise and other impacts as we think about our salt marshes. So here's just another diagram of a salt marsh and thinking about those areas that are regularly flooded and those areas that are irregularly flooded. And you can see it all depends on what that tide height is. So as we're getting sea level rise, that tide height is going to change. We have our current sea level, and we're facing a future regular level of what a high tide is as that changes over time. And so what we're expecting to see, if this happens in a natural and slow progression, is that the salt marsh will actually migrate back. As the water moves a little bit farther in every few years, brings sediment in, brings higher water, the plants actually migrate back within a salt marsh as long as there's space for it to go. So what you can imagine is that there's going to be a point where the salt marsh can't go back any farther. If you think about Folgers Marsh and Pulpus Road, sometimes that road gets flooded over with water because that water doesn't have anywhere else to go. It hits essentially a hard wall, and that's the end of where that salt marsh is. So with nothing coming in the way, salt marshes can migrate backwards over time. What we need to start to figure out is, do our salt marshes have space to go? How can they migrate back? Are they getting enough sediment coming in that they're adapting to sea level rise on their own? Because if there's enough sediment washing in to raise the elevation of the salt marsh, they can keep pace with sea level rise for a while. So we understand kind of the progression of what's going to happen as sea level rise happens, as we get climate change. What we're working on is, what do we actually know about the salt marshes that are here on the island? So these are some of the research objectives that we currently have within the Coastal Ecology Program. How healthy are our salt marshes at a base? What is our baseline? How are they functioning? How healthy are they? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Are they keeping pace with sea level rise? Are all of our salt marshes rising in elevation as our sea level is rising? And we can figure this out because we can already see change in sea levels on the island. How can we restore salt marshes? Do we need to restore salt marshes? And that'll come out of that salt marsh health question and understanding where our marshes are. And are there ways in which we need to intervene to help those salt marshes adapt to climate change over time? And then I have some pictures of some of the projects that we're not talking about today that we're currently working on. We have, I guess we were going to talk about the oyster reef a little bit, but we have the oyster reef that we put into Pulpus Harbor in front of Medowie Creek, which is one of our salt marshes. We're studying how that helps improve resilience at the salt marsh. We're studying salt marsh dieback in the middle here, places on the island where we're starting to see bare soil due to overgrazing by crabs, and how we can help the salt marshes adapt to that. And then we have a project out on the refuge, on the Cotu Wildlife Refuge, where we're looking at the haulover in Coscata Pond to look at salt marsh resilience and migration and how we can help that area adapt as well. We have a number of different research projects that we're working on within the program. What you're going to hear about today, and I'm going to introduce each of these speakers as it's their time to come up and talk, You're going to hear work from one of our year-round coastal ecology technicians and the research that she's doing here on the island and has been doing for the last few years. And then you're also going to hear research from 2 different graduate students who have spent summers out here with the Conservation Foundation working on these particular issues, the research projects that they developed themselves and then implemented here on island. They're each going to talk, and we figured we'd have everyone talk, and then we can do questions at the end and have everyone come up. So as you're listening to each of these talks, kind of hold on to the questions that you're thinking about, and they'll be very excited to answer those questions for you. The first talk that we're going to have comes from Jisun Reiner, who is our coastal ecology research technician and has been with the foundation almost 2 years now, and she's going to talk about something that's a big part of her work, which is our salt marsh health research at the foundation. Jisun?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Jisun Reiner. I am the Coastal Ecology Research Technician at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. I do a lot of the salt marsh health baseline research, and specifically today I'll be talking a lot about our findings from 2023 and also intro some of the findings from 2024. All right, so a little overview about this presentation. I'll first explain why NCF started doing baseline salt marsh health research, and then I'll talk about the marshes in question, the data that we've been collecting, the results from that data, and next steps for the future. Okay, so why do we need a baseline for the health of our salt marshes? Number one, having a baseline understanding of salt marshes is going to allow us to understand and monitor changes over time. So, like in this handy little graphic, why might some areas have plants and some might not? Why might this change over time? Number two is hopefully our understanding of these changes are going to inform future management strategies for these salt marshes for preserving and bolstering their health. Some marshes might be in better health already, while some might continue to be vulnerable to changes due to climate change or sea level rise. So having this data will allow us to prioritize which salt marshes need help first over others. And number three, salt marshes, like Jen was saying, provide numerous ecosystem services. For example, they are incredible breeding grounds for saltwater and freshwater fish and for birds. And they improve water quality. They act as a sponge and control flooding and erosion on our coastline. And of course, there are plenty of recreational opportunities in salt marshes as well, like kayaking. And we also host some kayak tours over the summer, so you should definitely sign up for those. Lastly, understanding salt marshes will allow us to continue mitigating climate change. Jen was saying that salt marshes sequester incredible amounts of carbon dioxide. One of my favorite facts is that some studies estimate that salt marshes can sequester up to 50 times more carbon than a terrestrial forest. So keeping these salt marshes around means that we'll continue to sequester this carbon, and also we won't be releasing that carbon dioxide back into the air. So these are just some of the reasons why we care about doing baseline salt marsh health research. All right, so these were the locations for our salt marsh health monitoring, with the 2023 locations shown in the yellow stars and the 2024 locations in the red stars. I had some incredible memories and some great times romping around these marshes with Bradley and Coleman. We spent a lot of the summer stuck in peat, and it was a great time getting bit by mosquitoes and greenhead flies. They definitely keep us on our toes. All right, so I won't go through every bullet point here, but I thought it'd be fun to give an overview of the data that we collect and how they contribute to our understanding of salt marsh health. So firstly, we collect data on vegetation and ground cover in these salt marshes. Salt marshes are divided into these different zones based on the species of vegetation that are present and how high the tide goes. So understanding which plants are where allows us to see how diverse the habitats are and how much space the marsh has to migrate as sea levels rise. Sites that are more diverse and rich in plant species tend to be more resilient to sea level rise, And sites with less bare peat exposed are typically more productive and can trap that sediment, which allows the salt marsh to grow over time. Next is elevation, where we use this really fun robot-looking tool called an RTK. And definitely one of my favorite parts of this research is getting to lift all of the heavy equipment into the marsh. And we gain a lot of muscle as a result as the summer continues. So collecting elevation data allows us to measure how much of the marsh is above mean high water. And if more of the marsh is above this point, the marsh is more likely to keep up with sea level rise. Next is hydrology. So we deploy these fancy looking logger tools to take measurements of water temperature and pressure, which gives us water depth throughout the field season. Once we analyze these data, we can understand how often the marsh is being flooded, which has implications for the pace of marsh loss as sea levels rise. Next is, there's a lot of data, but next is on the computer, we use GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, fancy name for maps, to look at our marshes from above and get a value for the area of the salt marsh, which has implications for how much ecosystem services a marsh is providing, as well as the area for mosquito ditch cover, which is an interesting tidbit of history. If you can see in this graphic, there are some lines, like very straight lines that go through salt marshes. And back in the 1930s, during the New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps dug a lot of ditches through the salt marshes because they thought that draining the water would help get rid of mosquitoes. But actually, that didn't really happen. We still have a lot of mosquitoes, and I have a lot of stories to attest for that. But essentially, the mosquito ditch cover changed a lot of the hydrology through the salt marshes. So the more ditching you have in a marsh, the more implications there are for the disruption of the marsh system overall and the potential for it to erode. And the last data point that we collected, which is kind of a new one, we did this past summer. It's bearing capacity. This is another heavy equipment tool where we carried out a sledgehammer through the marshes. And we took this pipe that was marked with different points and we slammed it 5 times to see how much this pipe would sink into the ground. And this has implications for the stability of the marsh. And if the pipe sunk deeper, that meant that there's less stability and, again, more potential for erosion in the salt marsh. So I had the pleasure of collecting all this data and doing a lot of analysis. There's a lot of frustrating times at the computer, a lot of muttering to myself, especially when the code doesn't work. It's quite frustrating. But the results are pretty valuable, and we're going to delve into some of them. So as for 2023, here is a little graphic that gives an overview of the overall salt marsh health. In last place, so the least healthy salt marsh that we found from analyzing all of this data, we found to be Second Point on CO2, followed by Eel Point, then Pocomo East, then Masquatuck, Pocomo West, and then Little Neck. So what makes a marsh more resilient? I thought I'd go through just an overview of our highest ranking marsh versus our lowest ranking marsh, and we can talk about, how all of the data makes sense together. So for Little Neck, which was the highest ranking marsh, despite it being the smallest marsh out of all of the 2023 marshes, it was the marsh with the most distinct zones between the low and the high marsh, and it had a lot of plant diversity. Not a lot of plants can survive in a salt marsh, but it was very noticeable that in this salt marsh there was quite a few more high marsh plants that existed there. There was also fewer ditches in this marsh compared to the others, and a lot of the area was mostly above mean high water, which means that it's more resilient to sea level rise, and there's better chance that it will be able to migrate backwards. Second point, conversely, was the lowest ranking marsh. And this marsh had the least plant diversity. It was dominated more by the low marsh plant species, which actually kind of looks like this plant. I don't know if that was intentional. There was also a lot more exposed peat, which means that there's more potential for erosion of the salt marsh. And also a lot of the area was below the mean high water, which it has implications for as sea levels rise. There's more likelihood that this marsh will be more susceptible to sinking. So in terms of our next steps, as you could see through all of the images there's a lot of data to analyze for 2024, and we hope to take all this data, do the same analysis, and be able to compare all the salt marshes to one another and get a full understanding of which marshes need to be prioritized. And hopefully we will use all this data to inform the creation of short and long-term management plans, because we want to keep our salt marshes around. There's a lot of benefits to it, and it's easier to keep them around than to rebuild them later on. And we're going to be continuing monitoring for the summers to come and collecting a bunch more data on our salt marshes around the island. And there's always more to study and more to compare. I thought I'd give a little special shout out to the mantises that we found in the salt marshes. This was definitely one of my joys. They help with the data collection. But when you look at a salt marsh, you might not realize how much is happening there. It often just looks like you're looking out on a plain of grass. And there's a lot happening in terms of the dynamics and the hydrology. And there are a lot of animals, including these mantises, that like to use the marshes. So they're kind of my favorite creature to find. And they're another point to why we should keep the salt marshes around. So I'll ask Jen to come back up here to introduce the next speaker, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Jisun. And as I mentioned, hold on to all those questions you have about what you just heard for the end of our presentations. Next up, I'm going to welcome Bradley Morgan. Now, the next two speakers you're going to hear from, as I mentioned, are our graduate students. Just a few years ago, NCF decided that we wanted to start hosting a graduate student initiative program that we've been working and building, and the idea is to invite students here that are already graduate students but may not have developed a research project, have them come and be at the foundation through the summer, work for us while also designing their own research project, analyzing the data, writing it up, and presenting the results of their work. So you're going to hear from two different students that are going to present the work that they've done here, and this is their research. They developed this independently based on the work that the foundation was already doing. So with that, I'm going to invite Bradley Morgan, who was our graduate student in 2023, and she did her master's with Northeastern University. Bradley, thank you.
Thank you. So like Jen said, my name is Bradley. Tonight I'll be talking about the research that I worked on in 2023 that was examining the effect of an intertidal oyster reef on sediment movement and biodiversity in Medawi Creek Salt Marsh here on Nantucket. So to start, and Jen has reflected on some of this already, but we have several threats that are facing our coastlines that we feel both locally here on Nantucket and globally, including things like coastal erosion and sea level rise. And we feel these impacts both with recognizable environments like dunes, but also less likely to think about our salt marshes. Nature-based solutions are a potential way to address these issues. They've become more popular over recent years because they're able to use the natural characteristics and services of natural ecosystems and habitats to mitigate some effects of climate change. And this might include, instead of using man-made structures like seawalls that might provide or cause further damage, it might include the restoration or use of ecosystems like salt marshes and oyster reefs. And I'll be focusing on both of these ecosystems today. Both salt marshes and oyster reefs are vulnerable to the effects of climate change themselves and have degraded both globally and locally in New England due to anthropogenic impacts. But both of these systems help protect our coastlines. They attenuate wave energy, they mitigate storm surge, and they can reduce coastal erosion to communities. Oyster reefs specifically can also encourage sediment deposition behind the reef to encourage better salt marsh functioning over the long term. They can increase local biodiversity, and they can improve water quality. Research shows that when paired with salt marsh or coastal systems, oyster reefs, when restored, can improve sediment accumulation on the marsh edge, better equipping it for lateral expansion over time or reducing coastal erosion. But there's not a ton of research on these types of systems, especially with intertidal oyster reefs in New England. So to attempt to address this issue and learn more about this, in 2021, Nantucket Conservation Foundation installed an intertidal oyster reef near Medowie Creek Salt Marsh in Pulpus Harbor here on Nantucket. Medowie Creek has a history of being diked, ditches, being used for agriculture, and Pulpus Harbor, the water quality itself is quite degraded. So the hopes were that using this oyster reef, we could increase local biodiversity, improve water quality, and encourage sediment accumulation behind the marsh, or behind the reef. And these were made with oyster castles shown here. So my project in 2023 was looking at what the impact of this reef was on the salt marsh in the surrounding system 2 years after its installation. We had 3 main hypotheses for this project. First, that the marsh behind the oyster reef would accumulate more sediment than the nearby reference site. Second, that the oyster reef site would support greater biodiversity than the reference site. And third, that compared to the reference site, the oyster reef would show increased light in the water column due to oyster filtration, reduced dissolved oxygen due to oyster respiration, and reduced water velocity due to the reef structure mitigating some wave energy coming towards the shore. We started by using 12 predetermined transects along both the reference and reef site. The reef here is shown as the red oval, and there's 4 transects across the reef, 4 transects adjacent to the reef shown in red here, and 4 transects at the nearby reference site shown in yellow. We then used 3 different types of sediment traps to look at different types of measures of sediment movement across the marsh. And we also conducted 2 different types of biodiversity surveys and used a variety of environmental loggers to monitor water quality. And I'll start by talking about the sediment traps. So here are 3 different types of traps: filter traps, tube traps, and bottle traps. And these measured net and total sediment deposition and suspended sediment concentration. The net sediment deposition was looking at kind of giving us an accurate sense of how sediment was landing and staying on the marsh. So sediment could land on the trap and then move freely while it was in the marsh, more mimicking what the marsh how it actually functions in real life. Whereas the tube trap measuring total sediment deposition was looking at the gross amount of sediment that was potentially landing in the marsh and not allowing the sediment to move off of the marsh. Suspended sediment concentration was looking at sediment that was in the water column, both over the marsh surface and in the nearby mudflat. And we also took net sediment deposition, divided it by total to find retention ratio, and that gave us an idea of how much sediment that's landing on the marsh is actually staying on the marsh. The net and total sediment deposition were measured for 16 days, and the suspended sediment concentration was measured for 1 day. And each of these traps were located at 3 potential locations on each transect. At -1 meter, shown in dark blue there, near the oyster reef, so that was 1 meter away from the marsh edge into the mudflat, and +1 meter or +5 meters were 1 or 5 meters into the marsh surface away from the marsh edge. Next are biodiversity surveys. We conducted 2 different types, So we used mobile fauna surveys to look at different types of fish and invertebrates moving around the mudflat between the oyster reef and the salt marsh, as well as at the nearby reference mudflat. We used seine nets to capture organisms, and then we identified and counted them in the field. We also conducted benthic infauna surveys to look at what sorts of organisms were living inside the sediment in the mudflat, both near the oyster reef and at the reference site. We collected 3 samples at each site, sieved the samples, and then processed them to then identify and count organisms using dissecting microscopes. And finally, our environmental loggers. Over the course of the season, we measured light, dissolved oxygen, and water velocity at each of the sites. So I'll talk about our biodiversity survey results first. This looks a little bit overwhelming, but I'll walk us through it. So we interestingly found a greater number of individual organisms at the reference site compared to the oyster reef site, and that's shown in the yellow box there. But 72% of those organisms at the reference site were shore shrimp, and 25% were silver sides, whereas the oyster reef site had 13 different species compared to the reference site's 4. So we had greater species richness at the oyster reef site than the reference site, and this included things like blue crab, winter flounder, and American eel. Next, the benthic infauna surveys. We saw a greater number of individual organisms at the oyster reef site than the reference site, and this included more mollusk, polychaetes, and insects, whereas the reference site showed more Nematera, Nematoda, and Crustacea. This was a really interesting trend to see. We saw greater biodiversity at the reef site than the reference site, but again, we only were able to do 3 samples at each site, so this is an interesting trend supporting our ideas, but we would definitely want to collect more data too to get a better idea of how this is really impacting the benthic community. And next, we found interesting results for our light and dissolved oxygen. Contrary to what we had expected, we saw less light at the oyster reef and more dissolved oxygen at the oyster reef than the reference site, and I'll talk a little bit about why we found that. But as expected, we saw reduced water velocity at the reef site compared to the reference. So what does all of that mean for biodiversity and the environment? Well, we saw that the reef created habitat for both fish and benthic community and different types of invertebrates, as we had expected. We also saw that the reef structure reduced incoming water energy, reducing water velocity at the reef site, so protecting that salt marsh compared to the reference site with no reef. And we had expected to see increased light at the reef site due to oysters being able to filter out particles from the water column, as we know that they can do, increasing light in the water column. But what we actually saw was that they created a really great habitat for subaquatic vegetation and macroalgae, and that vegetation just kind of took over the water column space more, so that reduced light to our loggers that was reading that data, and then increased dissolved oxygen due to their photosynthesis. So that ended up creating a healthy environment for the reef to function. But then what about sediment movement? This was kind of a question that I was really interested in, and we found some kind of interesting nuanced trends as our result, so I'll dig into that a little bit more. And I'll walk us through these graphs. So just to remind us again, we have the net sediment deposition and total sediment deposition on the right, and then we have oyster data, reference data, as well as different distances from the marsh edge. So the darker blues are the +1 meter from the marsh edge into the marsh surface, and +5 meters is the lighter blue, so that's further into the marsh. We surprisingly didn't find any statistically significant differences in either of these sediment deposition measurements across the both sites and by distance from the marsh edge. But we did see an overall trend in both sediment depositions with decreasing sediment deposition further onto the marsh. And the oyster reef showed this trend with more sediment being deposited closer to the marsh edge at +1 meter and then less at +5 meters. And the reference site didn't really show this trend. With net sediment deposition, it showed increasing sediment further onto the marsh, and the total or gross sediment deposition was a little bit unclear. Our retention ratio, which was the net divided by the total sediment deposition, so giving us an idea of what's actually staying on the marsh surface, was also not statistically significantly different across the both sites or by distance from the marsh edge. But it did have an overall trend of increasing retention further onto the marsh. And this made sense. So once sediment gets further onto the marsh, it's more likely to stay there just due to the amount of water that's getting there and the reduced energy of water being able to move sediment around. Our suspended sediment concentration. So again, we have our oyster and reference site, but then we also have the dark blue is our -1 meter, so that's into the mudflat away from the marsh edge. And we saw that this wasn't statistically significant across both sites, but it was by distance from the marsh edge. And the overall trend was decreasing suspended sediment concentration further into the marsh. And the oyster reef showed this trend really well. So we had the highest amount of suspended sediment concentration in the mudflat just behind the oyster reef, about 1 meter from the marsh edge. And then it steadily decreased further into the marsh. Whereas the reference site shows a pretty interesting trend of fairly low suspended sediment concentration in the mudflat 1 meter away from the marsh edge, actually peaking right around the marsh edge at +1 meter and then decreasing again further into the marsh. And this is, again, that sediment that's hanging out in the water column. So what does that all mean for how sediment is moving on this marsh? Well, we saw the highest suspended sediment in the mudflat behind the oyster reef, just about 1 meter from the marsh edge. And we saw greatest deposition early into the marsh, about +1 meter. It's showing that the reef is buffering some sort of water energy, resuspending that sediment in the mudflat behind the reef, and then allowing that sediment to deposit early into the marsh. And the reference site's marsh edge shows a really similar trend. We have the highest amount of suspended sediment concentration right around the marsh edge at +1 meter, and the highest deposition actually further into the marsh. In that way, we can see that the reef is acting similarly to the marsh edge at the reference site, resuspending sediment earlier on away from the marsh edge, allowing it to be carried early into the marsh around +1 meter. And that over time could potentially allow the sediment to accumulate in that mudflat and create more stable structure, eventually reducing coastal erosion and potentially creating an environment that allows for lateral seaward movement of the marsh over time, which would better protect it from coastal erosion, sea level rise, and make it more resilient over time. So what does this all mean for how we were looking at how the reef was behaving if it was doing what we had hoped when it was installed to protect this marsh? Well, we saw that the reef was increasing biodiversity and actually increased subaquatic vegetation growth. It buffered incoming water energy and reduced water velocity, and that created an environment where sediment could be accreted more effectively at the marsh edge, where it's more likely to be vulnerable to coastal erosion. And looking ahead at what this work can contribute to in the future, one of NCF's projects with this reef is looking at the longer-term changes in elevation and sediment accretion over time. This was a fairly short-term project that we got to learn a lot about how sediment was moving in this system, but the long-term projects are going to be really impactful to understand how long-living these marshes can be and how resilient they are to climate change. And finally, there's several different types of systems that these oyster reefs and salt marshes can function in. This was an intertidal oyster reef that was put several meters away from the marsh edge, but there's a variety of different systems with subtidal oyster reefs or fringe reefs on marsh edges, and these can contribute to sediment accretion and marsh growth in different ways. So being able to look at these different systems, how they function, and to be able to choose what is going to be the most effective way to protect these systems and scale them up so that we can protect our coasts in the future would be a great way to approach this issue. And that is all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley, very much. And next, but certainly not least, our last speaker of the evening is Coleman Miller, who joined us this year in 2024 as our graduate research assistant. And he's also getting his master's degree at Northeastern University and did some more work on sediment in our salt marshes that you're going to hear about next. Thank you, Coleman.
Nice to meet you all. My name's Coleman Miller, as Jen said, and today we'll be covering measuring and modeling sedimentation rates in some of our Nantucket salt marshes. Super Bowl Sunday feels a little bit more like Sediment Sunday today, so waiting for that one all day. In terms of what we'll be walking through today, a large part of the focus of my research was basically trying to figure out where the dirt is landing and how much dirt is landing there on the salt marshes, also known as sediment accumulation. And we'll cover briefly kind of why modeling makes sense for this area of scientific research. We'll go through some of the sites and methods for how this project was conducted, and then I'll do my best to explain some convoluted graphs that show where sediment falls and where it doesn't, as well as some of the possible restoration initiatives that sediment research like this can inform in the future. So in terms of why sediment is important, Jen touched on it briefly earlier, but when you look at the water, if you've ever gotten down close and you see all those little speckles of dirt that are floating through it, that's essentially the suspended sediment that Bradley was talking about earlier. And salt marshes do require vertical accretion and that sediment accumulation on top of them in order to grow and survive. And it becomes particularly important in the context of sea level rise, because these are, as has formerly been mentioned, ecosystems that are super sensitive to changes in inundation over longer periods of extended sea level rise. And modeling can be helpful to figure out where sea level rise meets the accumulation of sediment in these marshes. And the research that I've done over this season provides kind of like a quick baseline for what can be done and has been put into an annual model to show what might happen at these types of accumulation rates going forward. And really what we're trying to avoid is that concept of a drowning salt marsh, because they do breathe, they are plants, they are important. And on the left here is actually, anyone want to guess that salt marsh? No NCF people? It's the Hollover Salt Marsh, and it is actually inundated at incredibly high rates and is, I guess, considered somewhat of a young salt marsh, if you would. In the way that it's behaving. And then on the right is a drowning salt marsh in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, actually. So when we looked at salt marsh study sites and kind of the areas of concern for this experiment, there were 3 sites that were selected. The first being Folgers Marsh, second being Medowie, which Bradley just covered quite a bit in her presentation there. And then the third site that was selected was the Hollover Salt Marsh. And salt marshes, like Hollover, we later learned are not ideal for this type of data collection. And when the data came back from the Hollover accumulation rates, the marshes would have been growing quite a bit because of the high rates of inundation in that marshes. And the way that this data is collected, we essentially have samples in the ground that are collecting dirt. And when you have almost full water coverage at all times, the data there isn't valid for analysis. So we'll be sticking with sites 1 and 2, Folgers and Medowie today. And essentially what happened is 4 transects were placed in each marsh. So they go 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of from the mouth of the harbor and then out. And at each of these transects, we placed sediment traps at 1 meter, 5 meters, 10 meters, and 40 meters from those creek edge. These are all a little bit longer than 40 meters in the picture, but you can kind of imagine what that might look like. And these sites were selected not randomly. Folgers Marsh, Jen showed a photo earlier of kind of the water getting all the way backed up next to that bridge, but there's possibly some issues with the undersized culvert and the infrastructure there, so we were curious to see what the changes would be from those 3 transects in the front to that 4th transect in the back section of Marsh there. And similar story with Medowie Creek, also interested in seeing the effects of the oyster reef and also how it's going to affect the back marsh with the culvert there in terms of sedimentation rates. So how did we collect the data? After we got those transects out, Jisun very kindly helped me collect a lot of this data and carry all that heavy equipment around for the season. But we used that R2 GPS unit, essentially go out and collect the elevation and GPS locations for each of these. And then we'd go auger some holes in the ground and place these little netting-covered plastic centrifuge tubes right into the ground, and so they're approximately 1 centimeter above the marsh edge. And so what those traps were meant to do, they're on the far right under install there, and they're very well camouflaged and easy to step on if you're trouting through a marsh. But those are essentially where all that dirt and water is accumulating and falling into. And what was interesting to see is even at the 1 meter mark, some of these samples were completely filled by the end of the season. A lot of that has to do with the kind of changing dynamics in certain areas of the salt marsh, areas of dieback, where there's might be higher sediment accumulation moving around. But after they sat there for 2 beautiful months, they were brought to the lab. This is, I feel like, where a lot of the work for sediment accumulation comes into play. Jisun very kindly helped me clean and process over 180 samples that were initially pulled from the marsh. We weigh some pans, and then we fill up those pans with the beautiful sediment samples, put them in the drying oven. It took approximately 9 days for most of these samples to dry. They were super wet, so the folks at UMass Boston got to put up with the smell of burning crab for about 9 days in their lab, which was very kind of them. And then we'd collect the dry weight on that. But these samples weren't done yet. They then got combusted, repeated all of this at 500 degrees Celsius for 3 hours. So super baked and super cooked to get all the organic materials burnt up out of there, and almost lit the Northeastern Marine Science Center on fire a few times there. So it was awesome. But it was a 56 and 57 day deployment for Medallion Folgers. What we ended up with was closer to 128 usable samples. So all of those sediment traps that were put within 1 meter of the marsh edge, the data there didn't have high confidence in, just based off of the rate of accumulation we were getting, would suggest that these salt marshes were climbing up as if they were truly quite alive. And then 32 sediment cores were taken at each of the little sediment stations, the 1 meter, the 5 meter, throughout both marshes. And that data essentially gives us the sediment accumulation rate, which is in grams per centimeter cubed per year. And that's the data that we're able to figure out how much are these marshes growing. And because this is a seasonal deployment, you really can't have these marshes out, or these samples out for extended periods of time. So you do have to do it seasonally. So we have the summer season. If you wanted to get further accurate results, you would want to do multiple seasons throughout the year to get an understanding. But what I did for the purpose of this modeling experiment was adjust that and transform that data into an annual rate so that we can look at sea level rise in a more longer term perspective. And now we're onto those graphs. So in terms of elevation and sediment accumulation rate, that's the SAR. All the triangles you're going to see on the top here are the elevation of each of those sediment stations. So on the left, we've got Folgers Marsh. On the right, we have Medallion. Taking a look at Folgers first, you can see that 5 meter mark are going to be those taller bars on the first 3. And really what we're seeing is a much higher rate of accumulation of samples at the 5 meter mark, particularly within Folgers Marsh. But when we get over to Medallion, we see kind of a different story where there's less consistency. You also don't see that kind of correlated trend, and there's no statistical difference when you run a correlation between elevation and sediment accumulation, which I think is similar to what Bradley found in her study as well. For these marshes, and that's because there's so many different factors that play into why sediment accumulates in certain sections. You could have large patches of dieback in certain areas, different types of vegetation like Jisun was covering and runs in her salt marsh health studies. There's a lot more variables you can look at if you collect all the data to compare to try to understand why these systems shape up the way they do. But in terms of looking at the effect of that culvert in Folgers Marsh, so on the far right, the black circled box there with the purple color variety is transect 4 for the 5 meter, 10 meter, and 40 meter sample. And that's the sediment accumulation rates behind the culvert there. So you can see the 5 meter marks for transect 1 in red, transect 2 in neon green and transect 3 in aquamarine, maybe. They all have significantly higher accumulation rates than we're getting at the 5-meter mark for Folgers Marsh. So there definitely is some sort of trend going on with the relationship with that culvert, and there's a lot you could do to study that further, but definitely just something that popped out early in reviewing this data. And Madawi, of course, is a crazier story and doesn't follow a pattern as much. But the line separating these two is where the culvert is. So if we look from left to right, we're going like further and deeper into the marsh system. But we saw something really interesting happen in kind of the back hook section of Madawi Creek, where sedimentation rates were significantly higher. And this is in essentially centimeters per year. So we're seeing significantly higher rates of accumulation in that kind of back corner there. So some interesting things to possibly study in the future and understand the relationships of what's going on with sediment in those sections. And then to take kind of a more holistic perspective and understanding like more of the averages of growth and accumulation in these marshes, data was combined and segmented into what would be considered the whole marsh, 5-meter transects, 10-meter transects, and 40-meter transects for each of the marshes. So the blue is going to be Folgers Marsh, and the red is going to be Madawi Creek. And we can see they're somewhat comparable when we think about how much sediment is going to accumulate in 2050. And then up in 2100, we start to see that and it's technically the same for 2050, but there's a clearer separation between accumulation at the 10 and 40-meter transects in Madawi Creek, whereas Folgers is going to have a lower level of accumulation based off of the accumulation data that was collected in this. So something to keep in mind as we start to compare this to sea level rise in the following slides here. And so basically using NOAA's sea level rise data for Nantucket in a 2050 scenario and a 2100 scenario, was able to take the accumulation data for each of these marshes and compare it to 5 different sea level rise scenarios. So what we're seeing here is the same layout. I'm not sure how visible it is, but it's whole marsh, 5-meter, 10-meter, and 40-meter transects for Madawi. On the left is 2050, the right is 2100. And whenever the triangle is above the bar, that's kind of bad news is what it's saying according to this particular modeled scenario. And I think when we look at various models across the country and across the world for sea level rise, like it often is bad news. But you can see as we get to 2050, it's not as extreme of what essentially is called the resiliency ratio, where there's not a huge gap between the actual accumulation rates and the sea level rise rates. But as you get to 2100, you start to see that ratio changes a little bit and becomes a little bit more extreme in terms of the amount of accumulation versus sea level rise prediction. So in some scenarios, you're seeing intermediate, high, and high scenarios getting far above what these salt marshes could technically survive. And in Folgers Marsh, it's under these conditions, technically not much better and even a little bit worse. So we're seeing even intermediate low scenarios at times getting above the predicted accumulation rates for these marshes. And that's not to say that's the end of the world for this, because there is a lot that can be done. And this is an early stage model for one seasonal prediction. There's higher rates of accumulation in the winter. New England salt marshes traditionally is what a lot of studies have found, but that really depends on sediment availability in a harbor. So there's a lot more to be studied there. And the great part about this data and how it can be used in the future is in projects like Jisun, where great teams are out here collecting salt marsh monitoring data every year. If you continue to collect data on sediment accretion, you can get an understanding for sediment availability in this system and create more accurate results for modeling in the future if you did essentially want to work towards salt marsh restoration, things like thin layer deposition and supporting the growth of these marshes on their own, and as well as infrastructure updates, kind of understanding if growth is going to, or accumulation will decline over time based off of issues with outdated infrastructure in relation to sea level rise. That one's in there for Jisun, beautiful mantis. But yeah, like I touched on, getting seasonal data and getting multi-year data to understand the variance in the data is going to give you more fidelity if you did want to continue modeling these type of scenarios. And there's also some great tools out there called turbidity loggers. It's kind of what Bradley was doing with her suspended sediment concentration traps, that can show you where sediment is coming in and when it's going out in each tidal cycle, and can improve the fidelity of the research as well. A big thank you to Jen Karberg, Jisun, and the NCF team, as well as Yvonne Valancourt and everybody for helping out on this project. It was definitely a team effort, so a lot of thanks to all the folks out there.
All right, I'm going to invite Bradley and Jisun back up here too, and this is your chance to ask these guys questions. You guys can go stand on the stage, and I'll mediate as we go. But thank you guys so much for all of your presentations. It was really interesting to learn about what's happening in our salt marshes out here and what's happening with sedimentation. As I always say, it's elevation is key, and sediment's what brings the elevation, and that's the only way we're going to combat sea level rise, is thinking about creative ways to adapt to elevation. So with that, we're happy to take any questions, and I think we just have the one microphone, so I'll probably repeat back the question that you asked because we're recording this, not to put any pressure on your questions. Tobias.
I have three. I would love to know more about what's the difference in our marshes, considering that it's glacial moraine, it's very sandy. It's different than other marshes further up north or further south that aren't on moraine. And I'd love to know more about, are there any programs that are getting rid of the culverts that were put in the 30s? And then my last question is, out at Second Point, there's a ton of cedar trees out there, that are it's just the most beautiful marsh, on the whole island, by a long shot. And I was just wondering, how those cedar trees change the marsh, because it's kind of like this sunken forest marsh. That's a salt marsh. It's really weird. Those are my questions.
All right, so we have 3 questions from Tobias, and you might have to repeat some of them as we go and see which. Oh, do you have another mic? Okay. Maybe in the audience, yeah. Let me see if I can get this one out. So the first one, Tobias, you were asking about differences between our marshes and other marshes that might not be, like ours are on glacial moraines, so we have a lot more sand and other looser sediments versus some areas, in the north where we have our salt marshes are surrounded by more rocky areas. If you guys have ideas on how that might contribute to sedimentation or what's going on within our marshes. Anybody? What do we got? Coleman, got any thoughts?
We're talking about the different salt marshes across them.
Sediment, like how we see sediment in our marshes versus maybe some other places in the country.
Yeah, I think there are I'm not an expert in all of the East Coast salt marshes, but they're definitely, fairly different ecosystems and the way that they're inundated. In Massachusetts here, we can walk on a salt marsh. It's not necessarily recommended. I don't know, do you guys recommend that? But you might fall in. But researchers in places like South Carolina and Florida, because of the density of the marshes, the bulk density, I guess, would be a measurement for that, Jisun. You can't actually walk on the salt marshes in all areas. So researchers will have skinny little boardwalks that you have to walk down to get across the marsh and study it. So I don't know about specific differences in the minerality, but I imagine that plays a component of it. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, I would agree with that. I did my initial salt marsh research in New York City, and a lot of those marshes are not as sandy as some of our Nantucket marshes here, and definitely a lot sinkier and a lot more just less stable compared to the sand, which contributes to, allowing you to, it's just a harder surface. And I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on sand, how it plays a role. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. Those are really good answers. We have a lot of, because of being a glacial area, not being a rocky coastline, we have a lot of sediment that can potentially move into our salt marshes as long as we allow it to. Okay, Tobias, what was the, sorry. Hold on, Neil's got a.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, thanks. The biomass pounding, when you're doing the pounding to see what the depth was and how much was there, wouldn't that be connected to the sandiness or the what's there, what's available?
Yes, I'm still in the process of analyzing all of that data, but that is kind of the hypothesis that if there's more just like muckier peat, then it'll sink down further and is less stable. And that's what we were finding in New York City because there wasn't as much sand in those marshes. And when we were doing our bearing capacity measurements, definitely the sandier spots in places like, there was a lot of sand in like the Hallover and stuff, like that measurement was lower, meaning it was more stable.
All right. Tobias, do you want to repeat your questions? Neil, do you want to hand Tobias the microphone? Sorry.
Oh, I was just curious, what are remediation from the culverts that were created? There's a lot, the culverts I see, there's a lot of dead, they're brown. You see a lot of exposed peat versus where there's not. So is there projects across the country to end the culverts?
And the culverts.
Yeah, so there's kind of two parts to what you're saying. Like there's research that's going on to fix and mediate the ditches that are within salt marshes. And so we do have, we're not doing these research projects, although we might get to it based on Jisun Salt Marsh Health. That might be one remediation or restoration tool that we can come up with, is actually fixing those ditches so water's not rushing through it. As far as culverts go, that's what we're seeing with sea level rise, is that most of the culverts that have been put in are undersized. They're not big enough to hold the changing amounts of water that are coming in. So the adaptation is to either increase the size of your culvert or take it out and put a bridge in place if you need that crossing. And the state of Massachusetts does have a culvert remediation program that's working on it. We're actually at Medowie Creek, where the oyster reef is, and some of our researches, we had put in a culvert there almost 20 years ago now. We did it in 2008. There hadn't been a culvert, so we put in a culvert and restored salt marsh, and we learned a few years ago, because that culvert was designed for sea levels 20 years ago, it's too small now. And we can see the impact of it being too small now. So we need to, and we're working to adapt that culvert with hopefully a bridge crossing. But that's the adaptation, is to take them out, to change them, to shift them. You guys have anything to add? All right. And then your last question was about Second Point and the cedar trees. You guys have spent a lot of time out there. What thoughts do you have about Second Point?
Yeah, we love Second Point. We love Third Point. We love Cotu. A lot of cedar trees. I think the first two things that I'm thinking about, there were a lot of cedar trees, especially at Third Point. We saw a lot of cedar trees that were kind of flooded and just like standing trees. But at Second Point, there's definitely an area where there's just a lot of like upland. And our transects didn't necessarily run through all of the upland, but seeing all of those cedar trees does give implications for marsh migration and the ability for the marsh to move into those cedar trees, which I think we're seeing at Third Point because there was so much flooding in that area. We see a lot of standing trees there, which means that there's a lot of marsh migration happening. I think the concern is just the tidal influence on both sides of Cotu, and thinking about the limited space that is there and how it just will become pinched more and more as the marsh migrates. But it is beautiful. It's one of our favorite places. I don't know if you have any.
Well, the cedar trees are great. It looks like an art installation out there. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
When you say standing trees, you mean dead standing trees?
Yeah, dead standing trees. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we're actually seeing that at a lot of places on the refuge. We've been seeing that at the Hallover as well, adjacent to the Hallover marsh. There's places where the high water just in the past few years has been expanding with super high tides. And you go in and there's not a salt marsh there yet, but all the cedar trees are dead. and they're just standing dead woody material. So what we're expecting is that that salt marsh is going to start migrating in. We just have to figure out if it'll migrate in fast enough before it just becomes an open water pond, or if we have to take some actions to help the salt marsh kind of move in a little bit faster, because that salt marsh will be more resilient than an open water pond. So that's kind of our hope or our focus, as long as it's something we can keep in place naturally. Any other questions? Danielle?
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I actually have a question about the ditches too. I've always been curious, like, why salt marshes seem to be so good at migrating in other ways when we're not actively maintaining those ditches and they've been installed almost 100 years ago. Why, like, what is it about the structure that they're not filling in themselves?
Do you guys want to take a stab at it?
That's a great question, Danielle. Thank you. So, yeah, I think that there's really just like I said, the hydrology changes a lot with the mosquito ditching, and the continued flow of the water. There's not necessarily enough sediment coming back through those ditches to allow it to like accumulate upwards like that. I think through all of the ditches, the water is kind of just like running through, and there's continued erosion on either side, and it erodes on the sides to widen the ditches and not to like deposit the sediment to allow it to like fill in. And because the water is already present, you would need to put in enough sediment manually to actually fill in those empty spaces. Yeah, and one of the, I think, is it at Eel Point, where you can like actually see on the aerials these like mounds next to the ditches, and there are mounds of like high marsh plants next to the ditches where they dug it out and they just like put the sediment to the side. So we kind of had the idea of like, well, in the future, if we take those areas and just like fill them in, maybe that'll do something. Eel Point is very heavily ditched, so yeah, that's just one of the ideas we have for future research.
Anybody else? No, that's such a great question, Danielle, and I think you hit it right on. And the idea of like salt marsh sediment, like the actual stability or the soil that's in that salt marsh, it's all organic matter that slowly accumulates over a time, and you accumulate like an inch every 100 years or so. So just having that sediment kind of flowing back and forth in the water, there's just not enough time for it to sit and grow to that same height that the ditches are. So like some of the remediation things are putting plugs like far into that ditch, away from where the water is coming in from the harbor, kind of putting sediment and soil plugs at different intervals along it, so then it has a chance for that sediment to kind of grow up and stay in the ditch, and then hopefully the vegetation starts to grow into it. And then I've seen things where they've just put whole plugs of soil into the ditch, and then you plant into the top of it over time. But yeah, it's the velocity of the water moving, it just doesn't allow it to settle. Yeah. Oh, Isaac's got a question, Neil.
Do you have any ideas about what it is about the location of Little Neck that makes it such an amazing marsh as compared to the other ones? Like, why is it more diverse in all those parameters?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. It's something that I've thought about because, I mean, it's very close to Eel Point, which wasn't scored super highly on the map. I mean, even like thinking about the geography, like it is pretty nestled in there. So like it's not experiencing as much as like quick of erosion or like wave action as someplace like Second Point might, where there's like tidal influence on both sides. But yeah, in terms of its location, just because like I'm comparing it to Eel Point in my head, which is like right above it. Granted, Eel Point is a little more exposed, so I believe that like the exposure part plays a role in that. But Little Neck is an interesting spot because actually when you're like standing on the marsh and looking over the edge, there's a pretty quick drop off. So I think there's a lot of implications for how quick erosion is happening there. So while it's like a great, healthy, sustaining marsh right now with a lot of high marsh area, again, likely due to like less exposure, it's likely that within the next couple X amount of years, we'll see it kind of eroding back pretty rapidly because there is already a steep drop off.
Connected to storm, I mean, the location of Little Neck is affected by various storms, especially northeast. So that can be, cumulative effect. Because it's also a spot where you see lots of, let's say, denverers, which is be nice about it. And they're not just all from Hither Creek or from Little Neck. They're just coming in because they get caught in tides from the ocean side.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, that is a good point. And there's a lot of hydrology data that we have that we still have to analyze. Those loggers are quite tedious to analyze, but we're definitely going to get around to looking at how the water moves throughout the marsh and thinking about the storm and wave action as well. It's definitely a good point.
Any other questions, thoughts about sediment? All right, well, I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight in the snow and the cold and celebrating with us before you go on to your Super Bowl celebrations. I want to thank Bradley and Coleman particularly, who traveled down here today from Boston to be with us and to share their expertise with us and talk about their research. And Jisun, thank you for getting up and sharing your work as well. So to give these guys another round of applause and thank you for being here.